Good morning and welcome to the Catholic Foundation Investment Forum. We are thankful that Jaime Lanier, a past board chair, and Lisa Churchfield, current chair of the Finance Committee, will enlighten you briefly on their experiences with the ministry of the Catholic Foundation. I was commenting to the staff this week about how wonderful it is to reflect on the impact of the Catholic Foundation, the impact that we're having on the Catholic entities in our archdiocese through the annual designated grant distributions that each organization receives annually. The staff have been working on this in the last few weeks. In the next month, more than $1.5 million will be going out to the many parishes, schools, nonprofits, and the archdiocese from the endowment funds created and managed at the Catholic Foundation. Thank you. Now, in order to get you back to your offices and homes and end promptly at 10:30, we will not have any organized breaks. The restrooms are to the right of this room. Please feel free to also refresh your coffee and to take advantage of this lovely breakfast while we are speaking. Before we start the official program, there is a special person with us today who we must celebrate. Dick White, who is one of our board members, where is Dick? Right there, is celebrating his 90th birthday today. Happy birthday. We're so grateful he came today to celebrate with us in our investment forum. So I'm pleased now to introduce Father Michael Silloway, who will lead us in prayer to begin our session. Father Michael, a native of New Jersey, but now a fully invested Atlantan, is blessed to be the pastor of All Saints Catholic Church right here in Dunwoody. A priest of the Archdiocese for 14 years, he takes as his patron saint, Saint Michael the Archangel, and he relies heavily on the intercession of the Blessed Mother, Saint Francis, Saint John Paul II, and Blessed Chiara Luz. Thank you, Father Silloway, for leading us this morning in prayer.
We just at the parish had the great blessing of having the Sisters of Reparation give our Lenten retreat. And one of the sisters, her name is Sister Mary Augustine. She used to be an investment banker, but now she's given herself completely over to the religious life. And she told a great story about how when she goes to bed, she always prepares first by celebrating Compline, the night prayer of the church. And she looks for, as she evaluates her day and examines her conscience, looks for how have been the ways that I've stored up treasure in heaven, gold coins and silver bullets, ways that I've attacked the different weaknesses of the world, the flesh, and the devil. And I was just very inspired by that imagery of storing up treasure in heaven. So let's keep that in mind as we turn to the Lord and ask his blessing upon our event today. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the gift of another day. Your mercies are new every morning. Thank you for this opportunity to learn. As we seek to be wise and prudent with our temporal goods, help us, we pray, by your grace to always be yet more focused on storing up treasure in heaven. May this event today, in the midst of our Lenten journey, teach us how to be attentive stewards of what has been entrusted to us, so that at the prompting of your Spirit, we can mirror the generosity of your Son's most sacred heart. We make our prayer in his most holy name, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns forever and ever. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Good morning. My name is Jaime Lanier, and it's good to be back. I'm a former chair of the Catholic Foundation of North Georgia. Nancy has asked to introduce Michael Butkus, which will be coming up momentarily, but I've been asked to tell you a little bit about me and why I was involved with the Catholic Foundation. First of all, I'm retired from Interface, modular carpet manufacturer global, after 35 years. I'm a trustee at the Ray C. Anderson Foundation, also with the Mercy Care Foundation. I'm on that board, as well as a trustee at Furman University, which is my wife's and my alma mater. I served obviously on the board, but I was on the board for the full 9 years. A real pleasure. There's a story I'll tell, but I'll tell it one-on-one if anybody's interested for the sake of time. But there's a real irony of how I became involved with the Catholic Foundation of North Georgia. But please know that God moment led me to a wonderful 9 years. Later serving, as I said, as board chair, and then past chair. Why did I work with the foundation? Well, it's a unique mission allowing any Catholic to leave a lasting legacy. Is what really attracted me here. And why I decided to leave a bequest to the foundation is the board, in making annual contributions, is leaving a bequest. That gift can help make the foundation one that can continue on in perpetuity. The Catholic Foundation is celebrating 32 years here in the Archdiocese. For those not familiar with the Catholic Foundation helps Catholics make a lasting difference in our community. We ensure that the Catholic community and its ministries have the financial resources to serve and make a difference in the lives of current and future generations. How do we do that? Well, we work with individual Catholics who truly want to make a difference. These Catholics want to create a real impact both now and the future. And they also want to leave a Catholic legacy to Catholic organizations they mostly care about. The Foundation partners with all the Catholic organizations across the Archdiocese. The Foundation manages 425 donor-advised funds and endowment funds benefiting the parishes, Catholic schools, and many Catholic nonprofit and ministries. These endowment funds benefit our Catholic community now and ensure the vitality of our Catholic community for years to come. Thanks to an asset size of $126 million, well done, Nancy, since I've stepped off, in December, which represents a generous gifts of many Catholics from all corners of this Archdiocese. The Foundation is able to make grants to help make our community greater. More than $3.2 million in grants were distributed in the fiscal year, and $30.3 million has been given since 1997. We are truly grateful to all who continue to give to help us make an even greater impact on the Catholic community. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Michael Butkus. Michael joined the Atlanta Consulting Group in 2013 as an investment analyst. He is now a partner in one of ACG's consultants. His responsibilities include developing and revising investment policy statements, plan review and cost analysis, asset allocation modeling, manager due diligence and selection, and performance measurement and evaluation. In addition, he works with many of our mission-minded institutions on their socially responsible and ESG guidelines. Prior to joining the Atlanta Consulting Group, Michael spent 5 years with a boutique investment advisory firm serving high net worth individuals and institutions. Michael is a member of the Kiwanis Club of Atlanta, a parishioner of Cathedral of Christ the King, and a board member of the preschool at Peachtree Road United Methodist Church. Michael lives in Sandy Springs, Georgia, with his wife Taylor and 3 daughters. Michael is active in the Atlanta lacrosse community and enjoys playing golf when he isn't coaching youth soccer. Please welcome Michael Butkus.
All right. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you to everyone at the Catholic Foundation who puts together this great event. It's been really interesting to see the evolution here and the great faces, some familiar, some new. I have to go ahead and thank my wife, Taylor, for making her first appearance today, but more importantly, thank my mother for watching our children so that my wife could attend today. You think about optimizing a portfolio for a foundation of faith. What does that mean? I think that was a catchy title we came up with about 6 months ago, and then I've got to make a presentation that matches that. But when you think about the word optimize, which means to make the best or most effective use of. And so you think about investing, and you think about your life as a Catholic. My God winks moment this morning is over 10 years ago, my wife went through RCIA and joined the Catholic Church. And a gentleman, young priest at Christ the King, who was there for about 18 months, named Father Michael Silloway, came in and did our convalidation ceremony, and we haven't seen him in 10 years. And so it's just interesting to walk in this room this morning and get to reconnect with him and see so many familiar faces here. Before I jump into the subject matter today, a little background on who we are and who we serve. ACG has been around for over 35 years. We were founded in 1985 by a gentleman in the back of the room who's probably going to ask the hard questions today and may or may not have been up here with me in the past. We have about 100 clients around the United States and $12.5 billion of assets under advisement. We're 100% employee owned, and we do everything in-house in terms of investment and performance management. Clients around the United States, despite being the Atlanta Consulting Group, you can see based on our map that we live in Atlanta, and we've got a Delta hub, which allows us to fly just about everywhere to serve a number of Catholic clients. About 50% of them are clients that look just like the Catholic Foundation. Our average client size is about the same, and our median is about 60 million. But most importantly, a little over $3 billion of the assets on which we advise are Catholic entities. So, subject matter today. Laudato Si, USCCB, Mensurum Bonum. It sounds a little bit like a Dr. Seuss intro. And so just to walk you through some of these Latin words and Latin terms and the drivers of Catholic investing, we start out with Laudato Si. This came out in 2015, and this was the encyclical of Pope Francis published and translated to Praised Be, which I'm going to talk a little bit about Mensurum Bonum today, and I think about this as largely the precursor to Mensurum Bonum. It included 6 chapters on care for the natural environment, which has been largely the focus, especially in the media, but also people with a subtitle, Care for Our Common Home. The quote there at the bottom is, "All is not lost. Human beings, while capable of the worst, are also capable of rising above themselves, choosing again what is good, and making a new start despite their mental and social conditioning." And that applies a lot when you're thinking about optimizing your personal portfolio and the ways in which we invest, is thinking about these companies and thinking about not only what they do, but the good they could do. Past few years, we've spent some time talking about the USCCB letter. This has been the focus of those previous forums. For about 2 decades, there weren't many changes to it. It was largely prescriptive in that it set the guidelines and the rules. It was not a very interesting read, if I'm being honest with you, because it was just, this is what you should do, and it was classic Catholic teachings. Don't do this, don't do that. But more recently, they've added the word engage and added a few other things to it. It was updated in 91, and then 2003, and then finally again in 2021. The bigger question now is this newest document, Mensurum Bonum, which came out in 2022. Instead of socially responsible investing, we largely see the words Catholic social teaching in these investment policies. Mensurum Bonum is translated to good measure. And so when I think back at picking the title of optimizing your portfolio, good measure is probably the best way to approach that. It was published by the Vatican through the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. And what I would say is everyone in this room should leave this room at some point and go Google Mensurum Bonum. It will be the first thing that comes up. It's a 46-page document. I reread it yesterday. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from today's meeting, is for every individual and every Catholic in this room, and even a non-Catholic, to be honest with you, it sets a very interesting perspective for investing with your faith, while also recognizing that there can be some confusion there, investing with your faith versus returns. Where such guidelines have not been developed, Mensurum Bonum is providing a stimulus, an example to help to encourage institutions to establish clear investment policies by integrating Catholic social teaching into their investment process. So the question I often get is, now we have two documents. We've got the U.S. bishops with their guidelines, and we have the Holy See with the Mensurum Bonum document. Which one do we use? And what's interesting about that document is they very much call out that if you already have in your investment policy statement phrases and Catholic teachings, you don't need to use this document. It's just something that's going to evolve going forward. My personal prediction is over time, you'll see all these documents hopefully merge into one document where the various U.S. bishops are talking to the German bishops who are talking to the Italian bishops, and they put together a common document that can be used globally. So the spectrum of investing, what are we talking about today? Well, the interesting thing here is when I did this presentation in 2020, our very first investment forum, we spent most of our time talking about that responsible investing column. Catholic teachings at that point were largely negative screens. Don't own tobacco, weapons, gambling, pornography, and as I said, that USCCB document was largely prescriptive. Don't do this. But over time, we've started to see the drift from left to right, where sustainable investing, thematic impact investing has grown within the Catholic investing community and the community more broadly. I'll be the first one to say that that word ESG can be pretty hit or miss these days. I'll have a little cartoon here in a moment, but when we think about how we're investing within this community, especially at the Catholic Foundation, we look at that responsible investing category. We're starting to think more about the sustainable investing category. And then when you really think about it, the dollars that come out of the foundation fall generally into that thematic or that impact category, right? Those are going out into the local community and supporting the various organizations. And then finally, I won't leave it out, there's the philanthropy, which is not only giving here, but giving to your local diocese, and the Archbishop's annual appeal would be kind of part of that. So that's how you'd think about your personal investing. So politics. If anyone has a better political Catholic cartoon, let me know, because I've used this for 5 years in a row, yet it's still relevant. As I mentioned, ESG investing has continued to be highly politicized, right? It's become a bad word all of a sudden. Why is that? Well, you should only be about shareholder value. You can't outperform if you invest with your faith. You can see here, obviously, we've got the left and the right. They have varying opinions of things, but at the end of the day, we're pretty sure we know where the Pope's aligned. So the big question I get oftentimes is, well, Michael, if you invest based on ESG or socially responsible guidelines, you're giving up returns. Not so, right? This is the S&P 500 Catholic screened SSGA fund dating back to 2000. These are real numbers from the fund that is in the Catholic Foundation's account. And what you can see is certainly there are time periods where it underperforms, right? There's no investment out there that outperforms at all times. And you can read within the notes there what drives this, right? Overweight technology, underweight technology. Certainly over the last 2 or 3 years, that's driving all markets, right? But what I can tell you is that net of fees is that little orange line there. Over that entire time period, it is outperforming the S&P 500. So for those that say you can't outperform, here's some empirical evidence that suggests otherwise. Now, that's over a long period of time, right? There are going to be periods of time where you outperform and underperform, but what we've seen is over longer periods of time, you can outperform. So both at the Catholic Foundation and for you as individual investors, the first thing you have to do is build your framework. So when I think about optimizing that portfolio for a foundation of faith, whether it's your own personal assets, whether it's the Catholic Foundation, whether it's another organization you're involved in, you go through this. So I work with 10-ish different Catholic clients. And what I will tell you is that they do it 10 different ways, right? And that used to be a little bit of a knock, right? It used to say, why can't Catholics get along? Why can't everyone do things the same way? But over time here, as we've seen the word engage, as we've seen more flexibility, the Mensurum Bonum document even uses the word confusing a number of times, because there's so many options out there in the investment world that you have to take a step back and establish your own guidelines. And so what do? Is we start typically with the USCCB. If you don't have a document, Mensurum Bonum would be a great way to start and figure out what your beliefs are. and go through that. And as an organization, what we tend to do is that bottom line there is where we start with education, right? And if anyone would like to get together, I usually have 1 to 2 people a year that follow up with me after this meeting. Happy to grab a cup of coffee and walk you through how we think about that. And then you go out there and you find managers that can specialize in Catholic investing. Now, how many managers are there out there that hang their hat and say, we are a Catholic-only investor? Not a lot, but there's more and more. And then there's some other investment firms out there that are creating, investments that are maybe labeled ESG, but have a lot of Catholic guidelines associated with them. So what I would say is, as individual investors, you're getting more and more opportunity to invest with your faith. The best place to do it is to invest with the Catholic Foundation, of course, and then we can get you fully aligned. When I think about the USCCB guidelines, which largely guide the Catholic Foundation's investments, I'm not going to read this to you, but this is what we've covered largely over the last 2 years, are these 5 categories. Number 1, first and foremost, and probably the thing that most people in this room can agree on, is protecting human life. Certainly in the media these days, but something almost every Catholic client I work with agrees upon. 2 is promoting human dignity. What does that mean? There's some gray area there, right? Especially when it comes to everything from environmental resources, probably and then the next one with enhancing the common good. In some instances, these can run contrary to each other. So who in here drives an electric vehicle? Raise your hand. A couple people, right? You're saving the environment, correct? Maybe, in some ways, right? But my question would be, where did the lithium come from that's in that battery? And more importantly, where's it going to go when you sell your vehicle, right? And so that's where the common good and the promoting human dignity comes from, because you want to know that that lithium has been sourced from areas in the world that hopefully that mining was done in a way that's A, good for the environment, and B, protects the people that are doing said mining. Numbers 4 and 5 also get into the gray area here, right? It's not just negative screening where you say don't do this. It's pursuing economic justice and saving our global common home. While ESG certainly has a negative connotation to it in the current political cycle, what I will say is it very much turned things on its head. It's not in the headlines, but more recently, over the last week, there's been legislation passed that will enable the SEC to go after various corporations for how they're disclosing the environmental use of whether they're products or how they're sourcing things. Like everything else, it wasn't as stringent as we all would have wanted, but it is out there and we are seeing progression in that space. So Mensurum Bonum, what does that mean and what direction are we going to go with this? And I got a great analogy yesterday. So Jeff, if you watch this on YouTube later, thank you for the analogy. And I'm going to work in reverse order a little bit here. So you see this call to engage, call to enhance, call to exclude, call to unite. And I'm going to go a little bit in reverse order. So picture Nancy and I walking down the beach. We've got a bottle of water, plastic bottle of water, right? And so what we would say is when we're walking down the beach, we finish our bottle of water and we decide not to throw it in the ocean, right? Seems logical, right? Everyone should do that. Well, that's the call to exclude, right? As Catholic investors, I think we generally look through that list and say that's something we shouldn't do. Continue down the beach, and Nancy decides to pick up a bottle of water that someone had thrown on the ground. That's the call to enhance. That's us adopting a proactive stance regarding the contributions or potential of funds or enterprises to those environmental, social, and human goods. Then the next step would be Nancy sees someone throw their bottle in the ocean, and she walks up to them and says, you really shouldn't do that. And that's that call to engage. And that's coming through in people's portfolios, but through that direct engagement or active shareholding. So how do we do that within our portfolio? We invest in that State Street Fund, which has negative screening. We also look at it through some of the other Christian Brothers funds we work with that have an impact component to them, but also have that shareholder engagement. And so the big movement here is that last bullet point, is to unite as Catholics. If you think about the collective assets and the people in the Catholic Church around the world, if they were all to come together in some form or fashion, there could be real change. And so the Mensurum Bonum movement is really that, is to get different Catholic organizations to work with each other. Nancy and I have talked about, how can we work with other Catholic organizations? How can we talk to other Catholic foundations? I work with some various archdioceses How can they work with other archdioceses? How can we work with a lot of congregations of women religious? They often unite through groups like ICCR to vote proxies. And so the real end goal of Mensurum Bonum is not to change what's going on with USCCB, but to take the time to educate everyone and hopefully get them to work together for the common good. So what's the fiduciary application of that? This is directly from the investment policy statement of the Catholic Foundation, but there's very similar language in the Mensurum Bonum document. And there's two principles here. And the first principle is that the conference should exercise responsible financial stewardship over its economic resources. No one is asking you to sacrifice returns to do number two, and we also recognize, I'll use a priest's pension, for instance. Father Michael wouldn't be very excited if I told him we couldn't fund his retirement, but don't worry, it was 100% Catholic, the whole way. So we even recognize within priest pensions that there has to be a marriage of the two, and as I showed you with the S&P 500 example, you can accomplish that over time. It's the policy of the Catholic Foundation and the Investment Committee and the Board to comply to the greatest extent deemed possible. We are not perfect. And as I said earlier, I have 10 Catholic institutions I work with. None of them are perfect. I also think that's the greatest thing about this new Mensurum Bonum document is recognizing that not everyone is perfect. It's also the idea of this optimizing your portfolio for a foundation of faith is to recognize that your view may be different from my view, which is different from someone in the back. Certainly, there are common elements of investing that we're all going to agree upon. There are common elements of being Catholic that we're all going to agree upon. But some people drive EVs in this room, some people don't. And that's not a knock on either of you. For the ones that don't, that's probably not a statement. You just like your old car. Analytics are improving, right? So when it comes down to data and what we're actually doing with the underlying portfolio, we use MSCI as our ESG manager. Here's our fancy screen that we put together to look through portfolios. We have the advantage of paying a lot of money for software to look at varying investments to see how likely they are to comply. What we're also seeing from an analytical perspective is everyone from Morningstar, for instance. Everyone here probably has Morningstar. You get a Morningstar report for your 401k. We're starting to see more ESG resources in there. Certainly not Catholic, but more and more data that the companies have to report to these organizations so that you as an investor, and certainly for us as fiduciaries, we can make better decisions. It's certainly not perfect, but we have this data to make better decisions. So what's that result in? Here's your little bit of a commercial, right? As we have 3 portfolios here at the Catholic Foundation. The first is the Catholic Legacy Growth Portfolio. You may notice that that's got a new name. We're very excited about that. And when I think about this portfolio, this would be our flagship endowment style portfolio. So if you're thinking about the asset allocation and the aggressiveness, this would be sort of your endowment style performance, hopefully, an endowment style allocation. On the left side, you can see that there's certainly more risk assets here and less fixed income with a little bit of alternative investments within the portfolio. On the right side, you can see the underlying managers, many of which are explicitly Catholic. Others aren't, but we screen their portfolios to make sure that they are almost 100%, in most instances, Catholic. Our second portfolio is the Growth with Income portfolio. The important word here is income. When we build this portfolio, and in fact use the word optimize quite a bit, we're building this portfolio with an income mindset. Think of this as maybe a trust or something you've inherited where you can spend the money, the income. So if you look at the allocation on the left, a lot more fixed income. We're certainly excited about the rising rate environment within this portfolio because now we're getting a much higher yield than we were a few years ago. And we round it out with the Moderate Growth portfolio, which is largely charitable gift annuities and built around the regulations with charitable gift annuities. This is Nancy's world more than mine, but we found a great option there in terms of a fund that can satisfy that while also being 100% Catholic. So here come the numbers. Much more fun than last year. When you look at these 3 portfolios, I want to point out a few things. One, you can see the market values there. But what I want to point out is that balanced index. What is that? That is a monthly weighted average of all the underlying indices within our funds, gross of fees. And then we have those varying composites for each line, which are net of all fees. Why is that important? There are fees associated with Catholic Foundation. There are fees associated with what we do, and there are fees associated with what the managers do. And so our goal is within that realm to keep up as close as we can with that balanced index. It's in fact not the actual underlying index in the portfolios, but we measure ourselves versus those indices. And we're very proud of both the relative and absolute returns within the various portfolios. So as I wrap up here and think about the next step in discussion, I want to read the last line in Mensur Bonum. I really did. Here's the 46-page document. If someone wants this copy with my highlights, they can have it when I'm done. But Pope Benedict said, "Old models are disappearing, but promising new ones are taking shape on the horizon. It is towards that horizon that all of us are called to journey, living our faith by integrally investing our gifts and talents as well as our assets." So when I think about optimizing a portfolio and making best use of your assets, clearly this is a great place to do it. And clearly there are a lot of decisions to be made. But more than ever, there's opportunity and there's resources to help you make those decisions. Whether it's professionals like ourselves, whether it's your advisor, whether it's the folks at the Catholic Foundation, we're living in a world where everyone would have you believe. We could open Twitter right now or go on CNBC and they would convince you that it's a terrible day to be an investor, right? And things are harder than ever. They're probably mostly talking about Bitcoin today, right? But there are all these resources that are free, Googleable, and data out there for you to invest with your faith and hopefully build a portfolio that satisfies both your return goals and your role as a Catholic. That's what I've got. Hopefully we have some good questions today. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be around after the presentation. Thank you.
I wanted to know how I could invest my personal assets in the same manner that the Catholic Foundation invests theirs.
Yeah, it's imperfect, but what I would say is the easiest thing to go out there and do right now is to start with what everyone's probably largest investment in their portfolio is the S&P 500, right? And what I will tell you is there currently is an investment, ticker CATH, is an ETF that invests very similarly to that index I showed you. It hasn't been around as long, but I would start there. There are some organizations out there now that are creating mutual funds. Performance is not always perfect, right? When you get into active management, everyone underperforms at some period of time. But whether it's Christian Brothers, I think Knights of Columbus has some resources now. But also just taking into consideration, taking the time to say, okay, I own a fund, right? Go look at the holdings there and see what they invest in. Read the Mensur Bonum document and decide, how it's not going to be perfect science, it's not going to be perfect analytics, but you have a document you can compare your beliefs to and think about what they actually own. And so as an investor, it's never been easier to just say, Control F, find the holdings of this investment and do those comparisons. And so I'd say start with the CATH ETF if you wanted to do that. We're even seeing some organizations slowly get these mutual funds on the Schwab platform, for instance. And so there are options out there. I'd be happy to give you some more tickers after the meeting. I can't really speak to the fees or the specifics of Knights of Columbus, to be honest with you. I don't know enough about their investments. I just know that they're getting into this business, and they've long been in the insurance business, and most of those in the insurance business are also in asset management now. But I'd be happy to follow up with you, and if you send me some information, give you my opinion. And it, honestly, in your personal world, it all comes down to fees, right? And starting with, what are the fees and what's the performance? And the reason I picked that CATH is because the fees continue to come down on that investment. I think it started at 50 basis points and now it's in the 20s. And so as more and more Catholic investors invest in that ETF, the fees come down, which is great. So I read this 50-page document yesterday, and what I should have done when I opened Adobe is say, summarize this document for me. I would suggest you do that, because now in it pops up across the top of Adobe. And so it's a good point, because I think the screening will get smarter and smarter there. So your ability to look at it as an individual investor is probably bad news for some of these data analytics companies that have a monopoly on the actual data, because it'll get easier to analyze. But when it comes to AI, there's a lot of gray area here, right? And there's the really easy part of Catholic investing, and that prescriptive, don't buy this. Then there's all the other things that it's going to be a 50-50 split. You know, some of these companies that have the ability to use stem cell technology, right, would typically be screened out from a Catholic perspective. But on the flip side of that, they're creating malaria drugs that are ridding, sub-Saharan Africa from malaria. And so that's the way you may have as an individual investor that says, I think this is more important than this. So we start with the USCCB, as I showed here, but my guess, and this is just a guess, is that over time we'll move towards Mensurum Bonum, but I think there'll be a merge of documents there. They very much say, start with what you have. If you have something in place, there's no need to change. The biggest difference, I think, between those two documents is the engage component. I've mentioned this over the last few years, in particular with the environment, where when the U.S. bishops got together, they decided to say, each group can figure that out on their own, right? That's a touchy subject, and figuring out fossil fuel divestment is really complicated, because there are areas of this country where the Catholic Church has very much benefited from fossil fuels, and it's built up those parishes, and the money that comes in is from that. So how do you divest from something where the Catholic Church has benefited? Divestment continues to be a big issue. Someone may be getting ready to ask about it, so I'll jump the gun here. I've asked various organizations about divestment, and some say we're going to actually get rid of all fossil fuels and then we're going to add back. That's really complicated. Others start to just get rid of the worst. We do that. That's very easy. Don't buy the worst performing, the really bad companies out there. And so the example I was given is that engaging fossil fuel divestment should be done very similar to the way in which the Catholic community went after apartheid. And they did it in twofold. Some groups said, we're divesting. No companies in South Africa, we're out. Others said, we're actually going to go buy all those companies and we're going to vote the proxies. And someone told me that they looked at that as the Army and the Navy, right? They worked together in concert, and with one without the other wouldn't have actually succeeded. And so we have a number of Catholic institutions that have brought up divestment. None have done that yet. You'll see that in the news quite a bit. The Jesuit community in particular, the Jesuit university committees have decided to do that. But if you go read the fine print, that's also very complicated, because they own a number of investments in private equity, for instance, that they can't get out of. And so it gets very complicated. And this is where I think it's good, because you have the Catholic community hopefully all at least coming together and doing two different things in two different ways that should result in change.
To that point, Michael, regarding your three portfolios, have you made any decisions about how to approach fossil fuel divestment?
No, we haven't. We analyze it, and we look through to make sure that we certainly don't own any of the worst offenders. But the way in which I've looked at this is, here's another great example, is let's say that we divested, right? And that used to be the easy Catholic thing to do, is, if you don't own it, you're not part of the problem. But I'd also make the argument that if you're not part of the problem, you're also never going to be part of the solution. Because the only way, particularly in emerging countries that do not have the wealth of the more developed countries, the only way they're going to eventually get to some sort of fossil fuel or renewable resources is the investment from those large companies, who, by the way, have probably the most stringent CEO compensation and various things tied to their compensation. And let's be real, that's how a lot of these shareholders operate, tied to net zero. And so we'll see how it plays out. There could be a day in which the Pope says we're divesting, and then we would have to approach things differently. But for the time being, it's more of an assessment than an action.
Dr. Juliet Greco. You showed the three different portfolios, right, and the investment strategies of each. Can you just go a little deeper on like, why those three particular strategies? Do we have the right balance, and how often do you evaluate every out?
So we have three strategies, and if someone were to ask me today, where should I invest, I would pick the Catholic Legacy Growth, barring you don't have any specific trust needs or charitable gift annuities. I think that's generally the most diversified. It's the largest pool. It's the growing pool. And then the other two were somewhat created based on client need. And Nancy could give you some of the history there because there's certain donor advised funds in those pools or the charitable gift annuities where we had to create a solution for future investors, but also for the current investment. In terms of reviewing the asset allocation, that's done very formally on an annual basis. It's done informally all the time based on rebalancing and where the markets move. That's our role alongside the investment committee to make those decisions, ask those questions. We've had the benefit of a lot of net inflows over the last few years where we've had to rebalance money coming in. That's ideal versus money going out, which is great because that's being donated to the community. But as we do that, that interaction comes up then because we may get $1 million. Well, where are we going to put that $1 million? We have bands that are set within our asset allocation, and then within that, we decide where to put it. And not everyone always agrees, by the way. That's the benefit of us as a co-fiduciary with your investment committee is we walk through that, we think through it. It's not just automatic.
So also, all of our endowment funds except one are in the Catholic Legacy Growth Fund because that's a long-term strategy. The one that's the income with growth was created because we were the beneficiary of a trust, that the trust document created an income-only spending policy. And it's our largest endowment. It's the Conrad's Family Endowment Fund, and we do grants to Catholic schools from that. So we created a strategy to focus on that. And then the third one is, the balanced one was created because we have charitable gift annuities, and the American Council on Gift Annuities has a suggested investment allocation strategy in order to make sure that you have the money to pay out the gift annuities for the lifetime of the people and still have about 50% left over to go to the entity, the endowment fund that they pick, that they want to be the beneficiary. So that balanced fund mirrors the recommendations from the American Council on Gift Annuities. So we set those up for our purposes, and then we open them up so people who create donor advised funds with us can choose. So we have some donor advised funds in all three of those strategies. So
That's why I just manage the investments.
How do you apply ESG concepts to your fixed income portfolio? And I guess my question is when it comes to armaments, I get confused about the whole U.S. Treasury allocation because no one funds more armaments than the U.S. Treasury.
Yeah, we haven't told this story in a few years, but we had a group of sisters years ago when they were building their framework that said exactly that. Well, we can't invest in U.S. Treasuries because that funds, and so that's where you have to draw the line a little bit because if you eliminate Treasuries, your fixed income portfolio is going to be risky elsewhere. So we do not apply it in that respect. But from a fixed income perspective, in general, for whatever reason, we have less issues there from a screening perspective. There are also PIMCO funds, for instance, which we use here, that is an asset class that they will never explicitly call it the PIMCO Total Return Catholic Share Class, but it is not only Catholic, but has become more Catholic. They've evolved there. They had an ESG share class that became, I think it's Roman numeral 5 now, and that is the Catholic share class. So we address it from different perspectives. I think the ESG and socially responsible and CST, and there's all these acronyms now, have a lot of crossover. The difference being that Catholic social teachings and socially responsible investing have traditionally been way more negative, where ESG, going back to that matrix I showed you, had more positive and engagement components. And we're starting to see some good crossover there. Mensurum Bonum actually addresses that in a positive way that says we're not ESG, but here are the areas where we think we could work together. And so as you see the ESG movement grow globally, particularly it's been in Europe for years and years, you'll see more opportunities, hopefully, for Catholic investors to engage with the ESG community and enact change. Thanks. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, hopefully I've created some opportunities for you to think and ask questions. Our next speaker has all the answers, I hope. But we really appreciate everyone coming today. Thanks for your time. And if you have any questions afterwards, I look forward to speaking to you.
Thanks, Michael. Well, good morning. My name is Lisa Churchfield, and as Nancy said, I've been a board member of the Catholic Foundation since 2020. Some of you might think fondly on that year. Actually, it was a great year for me because not only did I get to join the board, but I retired from Chick-fil-A after 20 years. And I held positions in marketing, franchisee selection, and learning and development. Prior to Chick-fil-A, I spent 17 years in the financial services industry. Some of that time spent here in Atlanta, but also in New York. As a board member, I serve on the Finance Committee, and I have to tell you, I love the committee. It's a great, great committee. A lot of them are here today, so thanks to the committee for coming today. The purpose of the Finance Committee is to assist the board in discharging the board's responsibility regarding oversight of financial management and policies, ensure the financial activities are conducted in accordance with the mission of the Catholic Foundation and all legal and accounting regulations. I read that to you from our mission because we take what we do very seriously. And not only do we take it seriously, but John, who is our Director of Finance, John, raise your hand back there, okay, and Chris Bayamonte spent a lot of time making sure and ensuring that we follow things to the letter. And you heard earlier about 425 funds. When you think about the amount of ins and outs that come and take place in the organization, they need to be very, very specific about how they handle things. And I'm pleased to serve on a committee where the team that is supporting on the foundation side is working very, very diligently. I also serve on the investment committee and the executive board. So I get to spend a lot of time with the Catholic Foundation, which I've enjoyed over the years. Matter of fact, this is something I'd like to share, is we recently conducted an RFP for our investment services, and Chris Reynolds, Chris is in the back there, he took us through a review process, which started out with a very large group of folks that were interested in supporting us. We actually had 15 proposals that were submitted, and we narrowed it down to 3. And for those of us who got to sit on the investment committee and really spend time, we're so thankful for all the people that want to support the Catholic Foundation. But we are pleased to say that we are once again going with the Atlanta Consulting Group. And so we want to thank Michael and his team for all the work that they did to put things together. So thank you, Michael. Lastly, the Catholic Foundation has helped me to personally examine how I want to do my own personal investing and stewardship for the rest of my life. And so I have put together 3 endowment funds, memorial endowment funds, for people I personally care about. And I've also contributed to 2 others. The idea that something can go on in perpetuity is just so important to me. So I've been thankful for that opportunity through the Catholic Foundation. Okay, well, finally, I am going to introduce our speaker for today. I originally had received some information, and I thought, oh my goodness, I don't know if I can do justice to this individual, but I'm going to try, and I'm actually going to read to you his introduction. And Ronald Temple told me it was okay to call him Ron. So Ron is the Chief Market Strategist for Lazard's financial advisory and asset management businesses. In this role, Ron provides macroeconomic and market perspectives to Lazard's investment teams on a firm-wide basis and works closely with Lazard's geopolitical advisory group to assess economic and market implications of key political issues globally. Ron also advises clients of Lazard's asset management and businesses regarding macroeconomic and market considerations that are important to achieving their objectives. Previously, Ron was head of U.S. equity and co-head of multi-asset investing for Lazard Asset Management. In this role, Ron was responsible for overseeing the firm's U.S. equity strategies, multi-asset investment, as well as several global equity strategies. He was also a portfolio manager and analyst on various U.S. and global equity teams. Ron joined Lazard in 2001 as an equity analyst with 10 years of global experience, including fixed income derivative trading, risk management, corporate finance, and corporate strategy in roles at Deutsche Bank AG, Bank of America NT and SA, Fleet Financial Group in London, New York, Singapore, San Francisco, and Boston. Ron has an MPP from Harvard University and graduated magna cum laude from with a BA in Economics and Public Policy from Duke University. He is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the Bretton Woods Committee, the Economic Club of New York, the CFA Society New York, and the chair of Duke University's Graduate School Board of Investors. Please join me in welcoming Ron Temple.
Thank you, Lisa, for the introduction, and thank you to the Catholic Foundation for the opportunity to join again, and to Atlantic Consulting Group. It's exciting to be here, and it's obviously a beautiful time of year. As I drove here this morning, I thought, what better timing than spring in Atlanta? So thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour this morning on the macroeconomic front, and I want to leave you with three messages up front. Number one is the global inflation problem is not completely solved, but we've made a lot of progress. And I emphasize global because this was a problem across all developed and emerging economies, and it was met with the sharpest rate hikes in 40 years in the US and outside the US. And the message number two is despite that tightening, the economy's in a lot better shape than any of us thought it would be a year ago. If you think about it, a year ago, a lot of the conversation was, is recession inevitable? And most forecasters were saying 50, 60, 70% probability. That view has changed. But that leaves number three, which is the risks are not all gone, but neither are the opportunities. We've had a great year in the overall equity market, but as all of you know, a lot of that great year has been 6 or 7 stocks. And so I think there's a lot of the market globally that's been left behind where there are opportunities to put money to work, but there are still risks. And so over the next 40, 45 minutes, I'm going to take you through my views on the US economy, Europe, and China, and then also talk a little bit about structural inflation risk. I'm very optimistic that cyclically, we will get inflation down to the Fed's 2% target, the ECB's 2% target. But I do worry that if you look over the next 10 years, there are pressures that could raise inflation to levels above what we got used to before the pandemic. And just for context, from 2009 to 2019, US inflation was 1.9% per year. The Fed was very frustrated. They could not get to their 2% inflation target. I think over the next 10 years, maybe we're closer to 2.5%, maybe even 3%. But the big question mark there is, what does artificial intelligence do to that inflation story, and could it offset all the pressures I'm worried about? So let's start with that the global economic view. I do think it is important to say, even though the economic outlook is much better than it was a year ago, there are still risks, and it's still a muted outlook. If you look at the US, what this chart shows you is consensus growth expectations from Bloomberg as of last Friday. And what I've tried to give you a sense of is, what does economic growth look like? And I've also included the size of each economy. And you can see the US economy is still by far the biggest economy in the world. We're right around $27.5 trillion. China's the next one behind us at $18 trillion. But if you look at US growth, the consensus now is that we'll grow 2.1% this year in real terms. Now go back 6 months ago, that expectation was 0.5%. So the market and economists are saying, okay, we're going to grow 4 times as fast as we thought 6 months ago. I worry that that's a little too optimistic, and we can come back to that in a moment. But it's interesting, if you go across the Atlantic, the Eurozone expectation has not moved at all in the last 6 months. It's still 50 basis points. The UK is 40 basis points. Japan is 70. And so the rest of the world has a pretty muted outlook for growth this year, but most people expect that that growth will accelerate as we move through the year and central banks start cutting rates, lowering the cost of financing, increasing economic activity. Now, the reason people expect those lower rates is if you look across developed economies, you can see inflation has come down a lot. If we look in the UK, inflation topped 10%. In the US, we topped 9%. In both cases, we've cut that by more than half. And so inflation is much lower. It's still not at target, but we've made a lot of progress. The one gold line, by the way, at the bottom is China, where they have not had an inflation problem at all. In fact, they might have a deflation problem, which we'll touch on later. But a big part of that decrease in headline inflation has been energy prices. After Russia invaded Ukraine, energy prices in the UK were going up 60% year on year. In the Eurozone, it was only 40% because government subsidized consumer energy cost. And in the US, we had 40% increases, not because of subsidies, but because we have energy independence and we're not cut off from our energy flow from anyone. Now, if I take energy and food out of the equation, you see here core inflation rates across these major economies. Again, down a lot, but not as much as the first slide I showed you. But let's dig a little bit into the US inflation, because that's the one we care about the most in this room. Now, what I'm showing you on this chart is the consumer price index excluding food and energy. And by the way, if you're looking alongside in your books, this slide is updated for data that came out 2 days ago. Your book was printed before that. So there's one little data point at the end that you don't have. But what you've got here is core CPI broken down into its 3 key categories. The black line is core goods. This is all the physical stuff you buy at Amazon, Walmart, or Costco, excluding food and energy. It's 24% of the index weight, and it tells the story, in my view, of how this inflation story really started. If you look, you can see it really started to spike upwards in 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic. Well, why was that? Well, when we were sitting at home and couldn't travel and couldn't go to restaurants or movies, we bought more stuff on Amazon. So demand for goods surged at exactly the same time that we had semiconductor shortages, shipping bottlenecks, and labor market disruptions. So it was a demand surge and a supply chain shock at the same time, and you ended up with 12% inflation for core goods. That inflation is now back to negative. So the supply chain issues have been resolved. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea have not derailed this story. Effectively, that's behind us. The problem is that inflation worked its way into the service sector, and what you see in the blue line is shelter inflation. Now, importantly, by the way, this is not tracking the cost of buying a house. What the Bureau of Labor Statistics wants to capture is how much you would pay to consume housing. They don't care what you would pay to invest in it. And so this really tracks rent of a primary residence, and then this kind of complicated concept of owner equivalent rent, which is triangulated based on what people really pay for rent, and then the government tries to estimate what you would pay for the house you own if you were a renter. It's very complicated, and by the way, subject to distortion, which you'll see in a minute. That's 45% of the index weight is shelter. And then the last one, the gold line, is services other than shelter. So this is all of the other services you buy, everything from plane tickets to auto insurance to medical care. There's a lot of stuff in there. That's the remaining 31%. So I mentioned goods inflation behind us, but it worked its way into services. Rent inflation peaked at 8% year on year. The government data this week shows we're around 6. Service inflation ex-shelter peaked at 6. We're now down to around 4. But what I really like to watch is the month-on-month data, because the problem with the year ago data is that tells me what prices were doing 9, 10 months ago. What I want to see is, has the Fed rate increase cycle, has monetary policy tightening worked? And what you can see, the black line here shows that core goods have been going down in price for 7 of the last 8 months. And I'll show you in a moment. Well, actually, I'll skip ahead. It's all about used car prices. During the pandemic, new cars, we didn't have enough of them because of semiconductor shortages. So the automakers ramped up their new car prices. And if you needed a car and couldn't get one, you went to the used car market. And oh, by the way, you can blame Hertz and Avis for part of this. They sold a lot of their car fleets in 2020, trying to raise cash to avoid bankruptcy. When we all started traveling again in 2021, they had to buy anything that would drive. And so they drove prices of cars up. And by the way, you might recall pre-pandemic, when you would go to Hertz, you got a car with no more than 30,000 miles. After the pandemic, you get 50, 60,000 miles in a car that doesn't smell very good. And so effectively, that has been a big part of this, but we're seeing the black line in negative because used cars have been coming down. Now, interestingly, in January, used car prices went down the most since 1969. In February, they went up a little bit. When you look at core CPI, that was literally a 10 basis point swing in the overall number in inflation. That's big for something that's 3% of the index. But if we look at the blue line and the gold line, that's what's really caused consternation in the markets over the last 5 weeks. In January, we had a big upside surprise in inflation because shelter popped up to 60 basis points month on month. So again, keep in mind, if you're compounding that out, that's like a 7.5% annualized rate of inflation. And services went to 85 basis points, which compounds to 10.5% inflation. The data that came out this week shows both of those came back down. Services went from 85 back to 47. Why was there such a big swing? It seems the seasonal adjustments in the January data didn't get the job done in terms of certain price increases that happen once a year. For example, medical care services, a lot of hospitals and insurance companies reprice in January. In theory, seasonal adjustments should get that dealt with. It doesn't seem to have worked because in February, that spike went away entirely. We also saw auto insurance, by the way, for the last 5 months has been a key contributor. You might have noticed your own auto insurance bills going up. This month, that was a little bit less. Then there's a whole list of other things. If you really want to get the weeds and torture yourself, we can do that afterwards. But bottom line is, I'm quite confident we're going to see inflation at a run rate of 2.5% by June of this year, because I expect core goods to be close to zero as used car prices keep normalizing and new car prices come down. And I also believe we're going to see housing come down because the private market data tells us that's what has happened. This chart shows you the Zillow Observed Rent Index. The gray band looks at the top 100 cities in the US from the lowest rent inflation to the highest, and the blue line is the national index. There are 2 things you need to know about this chart. Number 1, Zillow only tracks new leases. They don't try to track renewals. And because they only track new leases, that leads to thing number 2 you need to know, which is this data tends to lead the CPI and the personal consumption expenditure data by a year. Because it takes about a year for the price increases in the current market to work their way through to all of the renewing leases. And by the way, if you've ever been a landlord, if you have a good tenant, it might take 2 or 3 years because you don't really want to raise the rate 10 or 20% because you don't want to lose a tenant, have an empty apartment when you know they're really good tenants. So bottom line is, what you see on the blue line is we had rent inflation peak at 16% year on year in February of 2022. For the last 8 months, it's between 3.25% and 3.6% every month. So that should work its way into the blue line on this chart being cut 20 to 30% by June of this year, which is a material reduction in overall inflation. But then the other big piece, that 31% that was the gold line, services excluding shelter, should be largely about labor markets. And yet again, there I'm pretty confident. And I do think this is where the Fed has managed what I call an immaculate disinflation. And what I mean by that is we've never had a cycle before where you raise rates this much and you don't get a recession. Well, this shows you unemployment. We're at 3.9%. The lowest level since 1969 is 3.4%. So we're still basically at full employment by any economist's definition. If we look at the job creation in 2023, 248,000 jobs per month. The first 2 months of this year, 252,000. The U.S. needs about 130 to 140,000 jobs a month to accommodate population growth. So we're still creating more jobs than we need. The only reason the unemployment rate has ticked up from the bottom is more people are coming back into the labor market from the sidelines and basically wanting to get a job because labor markets have been tight and wages have gone up. Now, by the way, if you were at the Fed, these 2 charts would make you nervous that you need to keep rates high because you would say, not so sure service inflation is going to come down, the labor market's still tight. But this chart shows you the number of unfilled jobs in the US per unemployed person has gone from 2 to 1.37 in the last 2 years. So basically, at one point, there were literally 2 jobs for every unemployed American. Now it's 1.37. That tells you there's less tightness in the market. And the better indicator, if we look at the percentage of people who quit their job every month, presumably because they got a better job, that peaked at 3% 2 years ago. It's now down to 2.1%. The red line shows you the average of the 2 years before the pandemic. Key message here is we're back to more normal levels. Now, there's one other data point that I really like. Bank of America has what they call the B of A Institute, they anonymize and aggregate all of their customer data for their deposit customers. So basically, you're talking 20% of American households across the entire country. And what they do is they track when you change direct deposit. And they also track when your direct deposit stops, meaning you lost your job or you retired. What they found in the third quarter of 2023 across all age groups is the percentage of people changing direct deposit went down from the year before. But more importantly, for the people who did change their jobs, in third quarter of 2022, the average wage increase was 18%. In 2023, it was 10.8%. So yet again, when you look at this data, fewer open jobs, fewer people quitting, it all says to me there's less pressure in the labor market to pay up to get workers. You might even recall, by the way, it was a few months ago, Walmart said they were cutting their starting pay by $1 an hour because they didn't have to pay up as much anymore. And all of that leads to this really ugly chart, which is 3 different data series about wage growth. All of them are decelerating over the last 2 years, which should give the Fed confidence that mission is largely accomplished but not complete. And I think will lead to the Fed starting to cut rates in June, and I think we'll get 100 basis points of rate cuts by year end and another 100 basis points next year. Now, importantly, by the way, that market expectation has moved a lot year to date, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But I do think when the Fed eases rates, they'll stop above 3%. And that is an out of consensus view. I think the US economy is too strong for the Fed to take us back to 2 or 2.5. The good news there is you actually might earn some money on your cash after this cycle is over, unlike the prior cycle where we were at 0. But it also means, in my view, that 10-year yields on treasuries probably are not going to come down very much from current levels. And that has big implications for the stock market, which we'll cover in a moment. Now, in Europe, there are certain similarities. There are also differences. The similarities, unemployment rate is the lowest it's been since the euro was created in 1999. It's 6.4%. The US is 3.9. Europe historically has always had a higher unemployment rate, less flexible labor markets. But bottom line, it's in a good place. The percentage of jobs that are vacant in Europe is still very high relative to history, although it's ticked down lately. But unfortunately, that's where some of the similarities end. This chart is a diffusion index. It shows you European consumer confidence. Now, a diffusion index basically has the percentage of people who are positive minus the percentage of people who are negative, and then that's the net number. In theory, over time, you should oscillate between positive and negative on the net. In the last 38 years, European consumer confidence has not had a single month where confidence was positive. Now, when I try to understand why that is, I think it's 2 or 3 big factors. Number one, if you look at real GDP growth per person in Europe over the last 20 years, it's been half of the United States. Income just hasn't grown very much. And if you think about it, and again, I'm not saying you should never own European equities. There are some great companies in Europe. But the reality is, if you think about innovation, the US is so much better at innovation. We celebrate people who start businesses and fail. In Europe, that is not the culture. Now, Europe has great healthcare innovation. They have great luxury handbag innovation, but they don't do everything as well as the US. And frankly, even in autos, which historically were the wheelhouse for Europe, they're way behind on EVs. It's BYD and Tesla. And so I think Europe has an issue there. But the other issue is demographics. The median age of an American is 38.1 years. The median age of a European is 44.5. In Italy, it's 49. So if you look at lower birth rates, less immigration, older population where their income hasn't grown very much, what do? You end up being less confident. And when you're less confident, you spend less money and you put less money into risky assets like equities, venture capital, private equity, and you get less growth. It's a vicious downward spiral. And what we see in Europe is the savings rate is 14%. In the US, it's 4%. So Europeans don't spend as much because they're less confident, and that is an anchor on growth. But I do think that anchor is starting to lighten a little bit. This shows you natural gas prices in Europe. Very clear when Russia invaded Ukraine, prices went up 1,000% for natural gas. Imagine if you were a chemical company in Germany trying to compete with an American chemical company where prices did go up, but nowhere near that, maybe 50%. This was devastating for competitiveness, but those prices have now gone back down, which should help what you see on this chart, which is the blue line is German industrial production. The gold line is energy-intensive industrial production in Germany. 20% below where it was before Russia invaded Ukraine. What's surprising to me is we've seen no uptick despite those energy prices coming down. But this might also reflect a structural concern in Germany in particular, is the fear that they will never be cost competitive with the US again because the US has its own energy supplies and seems to be much more advanced, whereas in Europe, the green agenda is making it more and more expensive for them to produce. Now, two other metrics here. This is manufacturing purchasing manager index data. You can see that confidence or sentiment is improving. The key thing to know is anything below 50 on this chart means the economy is shrinking. Anything above 50 means you're growing. We're basically coming from very low levels, but there's an encouraging sign there of increasing sentiment. Same thing on services. And I do think the last thing I'll say on Europe, lower energy prices, at some point, hopefully, a resolution of Russia, Ukraine, and then ECB rate cuts should lift this story as we move through the year. And one more comment, when you look at monetary policy in Europe, it's important to recognize it works faster in a more magnified way than in the US. In Europe, 70% of corporate borrowing is from banks. In the US, 80% of corporate borrowing is the bond market. In the US, it's typically fixed rate bonds. In Europe, you got a lot more floating rate debt. So when the ECB raised rates 450 basis points, that hit the bottom line for a lot of companies in Europe faster than it did in the United States. Also in the US, 90% of mortgages are fixed rate. In Europe, it's very uncommon to have a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. France has some of them, Germany has some. Most other countries are floating rate mortgages. So when you raise rates 450 basis points, there might be a 1-year lag, but your interest rate on your mortgage goes up, your consumption goes down. So when Europe starts cutting rates this year, I think also in June, I think you'll get 100 basis points by the end of the year. That will lift consumer spending and corporate confidence more rapidly than you'll see it in the US. Now, last but not least on China, and by the way, I want to be careful on China because I think in the US, I wish there were more things that were bipartisan, but if there's one thing that's bipartisan, it's a negative view on China. And I'm always trying to be careful that there's not some sense of schadenfreude of being happy that China's economy is doing poorly. And I think as Americans, we should all want China's economy to do well, but not too well, because you don't want the economy to hit the rocks and have social instability that leads the government to distract people with nationalism and military aggression. So you want enough growth to be good, but not too much. Well, the challenge I see in China is this. This is consumer confidence in China. It's basically at all-time lows. It fell off a cliff during COVID when people were locked down. You might recall the one tragedy too where a building caught on fire and people could not get out because they were literally locked in their homes. That's when you started to have the protests and the government finally gave up on zero COVID. I expected more of a bounce when that ended. We got a 2-month bounce in confidence and then it rolled right back over. To me, the big issue in China is all about housing and real estate. 3.5 years ago, the Chinese government realized there was too much debt in the property developer segment and they had too big of a property development segment as a portion of the economy. So they created what they called the 3 red lines policy. And they said if you have too much debt as measured by one of 3 metrics, you can't borrow any more money as a developer. Well, that started a process where developers started defaulting on their debts because they needed to borrow new money to pay off old money, but they couldn't get it. When the developers started defaulting, that led consumers to be afraid to buy housing units from them, typically apartments, because the Chinese model is very different from the US model. In China, you pay for the apartment up front and you get it 2 years later while you're making a mortgage payment for those 2 years. Well, the problem is when the developers started defaulting, you're paying a mortgage for 2 years, you didn't get your house. And so they stopped buying. So now you can't get credit from the bank and you can't get money from selling property. If you look at the top 100 real estate developers in China now, 85% of the privately owned developers are in default. And 13% of the state-owned developers are in default, which is the real shocker, because if the government owns you, why would anyone question your creditworthiness? The problem is they can't sell new units. Now, what we've found in looking at previously occupied housing units is prices in Tier 1 cities. There are 4 Tier 1 cities in the US, basically Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, and one other. There are 100 million people in those 4 cities. Prices in those cities are down 25 to 30% for houses. In Tier 3 cities, which are the smaller cities, they're down over 40%. Now, this index shows you house prices in China. This is the index most economists and investors watch. You don't see that story on this price index because this is the 70 city home price index. And what it tracks is the registration price, i.e. if this table and I were basically building 1,000 apartments in Chengdu, we go to the local government, we say, here's what we want to build, these are the prices we want to charge. That's what gets captured in this index. If we end up having to discount the apartments to sell them, it's not here. And what's been very common in China is not to lower the price, but to throw in free extras like, here, I'll give you a parking spot or I'll give you a voucher to go buy your appliances. So effectively, you've got discounting across the spectrum. but preferences have shifted to buying existing apartments because people don't believe they're going to get the new one if they buy it. So bottom line, I think China's got 2 to 3 years ahead of it of housing-related challenges. And the reason I say 2 to 3 years, because of all these credit issues, new housing starts in China are down 60% in the last 18 months. Now, that's been devastating for an economy where housing is somewhere between 15 and 30% of the entire economy. 15% is if you just capture the construction. 30% is if you include the bank loans and all of the services and the brokers and everything involved with real estate. So you basically had a huge part of your economy shrink, which is why I also think you should not rely on government GDP data, because this year China says they grew 5.2%. There is no way that's true. A big part of their economy shrank at least 10%. There were no offsets anywhere else. I think they probably grew 2%, and I think over the next 2 to 3 years, you probably get 3 to 4% growth. Now, by the way, historically, China would have solved this with more debt. They would have turned on the credit spigots. This chart just shows you system-wide credit outstanding. It's growing 10% a year, but if you go back to 2015, the economy slowed down then. They ramped it up to 20%. They're not doing it this time because China is the 4th most levered large economy in the world. They don't want to solve a leverage problem with more leverage. But what they also have seen, which adds insult to injury, is corporates from outside China pulling money out of China. This chart shows you foreign direct investment. And by the way, I think this is the most bullish chart in the deck for every emerging market other than China. If you look over the last 15 years, all of the foreign direct investment into emerging markets went to China. Now, what you see in that one red line is for the first time since China started recording this data in the 3rd quarter of last year, more money was pulled out of China than invested into China by foreign companies. 4th quarter, it ticked back to positive, but there's a very clear trend of falling off the cliff there. That money, in my view, is going to Mexico, India, Indonesia. It's not coming back to the US. We're still too expensive relative to emerging markets, but I think this could be a great trade in emerging markets. One last thing, the government is not asleep at the switch. They know there's a problem. They've announced dozens of stimulus measures. I do think over the next year, we will see these stimulus measures cumulatively start to lift growth in non-residential real estate areas. Now, this again is a great reminder of macro and markets are 2 different topics. I think the Chinese equity market might actually be one of the best performers in the next year because the sentiment is so negative and upside surprises are just completely unexpected. In the last month, we've actually seen Chinese equities outperform despite this negative macro view. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to zip through the structural issues. I do think, and by the way, this is a view I've had for about 18 months, that structurally inflation might be higher over the next 10 years. There are 2 main reasons for that. One is changing global supply chains. Most importantly, when I say that, it's a little broader than that. It's not as cheap to produce in China as it used to be, and so China's ability to export deflation is less than it used to be, in my view. But add on to that, companies from the West don't want their capital tied up in China like they used to. They're willing to pay a little more to produce in Mexico or Thailand or Indonesia, so that's going to add to inflation. But if I add on to that the cost of climate change and the energy transition, this bottom left chart, the left chart is from McKinsey. They estimate we will have to spend $275 trillion globally over 30 years for the energy transition. The International Energy Agency says $175 trillion. Even if it's $75 trillion, the way I think about this is we're going to need fossil fuels for the next 20 to 30 years. We use 100 million barrels per day equivalent of energy every day globally. And we need to build an entirely new renewable infrastructure alongside that, run them in parallel until you can start decommissioning the fossil fuels. That's going to be really expensive. Whether you have an EV or an internal combustion engine, it doesn't matter. You're going to pay more for goods and services because the entire global economy is going through this transition. I worry, however, but we're underinvesting in the renewables, despite the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think was a great piece of legislation, but we're also maybe underinvesting in fossil fuels. So one of my concerns is a lot of the big oil companies have heard the message from shareholders that they don't want them investing in drilling wells because we're all going to use EVs and we don't need oil. We actually need a lot of oil for the next 5-10 years. And so I worry that there's a risk oil prices could be at $150 a barrel in the next 3 to 5 years because we don't invest enough in replacing depletion of proven reserves. And so I think those are 2 big issues. And I'm just going to remind you, this is a view for the last 18 months. What's made me question my view is I think artificial intelligence could be very deflationary for the service industry. So maybe what you end up with is higher inflation for goods, lower inflation for services. Bottom line, I think the risks have gone up, but let's look at what the market says. So this chart shows you the Fed funds futures in the US, and what the market is saying, you're going to get the first rate cut in June, and we'll get somewhere between 3 and 4 rate cuts by the end of the year. That's the gold line at the very end. The light gray line you can barely see is from January 12th. At that point, the market was saying we were going to get 6 to 7 rate cuts by the end of the year. And so I wanted to highlight the market has been wild mood swings around what to expect. In October of last year, the market was saying 2 rate cuts in 2024. Bottom line, I think we're probably in about the right place. The market is saying inflation is going to be a little higher over the next 5 years, maybe 2.2% on average, compared to that 1.9% over the decade before the pandemic. So the market's part of the way, to my view, of maybe we got to 2.5. If I look at Europe, the market is saying we'll get basically 4 rate cuts by the end of the year, starting in June. I think that's about right at this point. And if I look at Japan, this is the really interesting one. It's the only major central bank in the world that has not raised rates yet. Overnight rates are still at negative 10 basis points, where they've been for years. There's a lot of speculation at the March or April meeting of the Bank of Japan we'll get the first rate hike to 0. Now, by the way, that might not sound important, but Japan has been pumping money into markets while the Fed and the ECB have been pulling money out of markets. When you have no one left putting money in markets, it could actually move global markets on the margin. So when I look at fixed income, I mentioned earlier, I think the Fed easing cycle ends at 3 to 3.5. The way I think about this is if the peak of your interest rate, sorry, let me step back. When you think about what yield you should get on a 5-year bond or a 10-year bond, the way I approach this is I say, well, what could I get if I just owned T-bills, or if I just invested in overnight money with Fed funds? Well, if the Fed funds rate peaks at 5.25 to 5.5, and if it troughs at 3 to 3.5, let's say over the next 5-10 years, that means on average I could get 4% on my overnight money on T-bills. Well, if I'm going to commit to owning a 10-year treasury, I want 4.5 to 5% for that. So I think we're actually a little below fair value on US 10-year treasuries at current rates of 4.10, 4.20. So I'm a little less optimistic on that. But where this becomes important is when you think about equities. If the 10-year yield is going to be stuck between 4 and 5 over the next, say, 5 years, then what do you pay for equities? Well, if you look at the US, the S&P 500 is at 21 times forward earnings. So I could get a 4% yield by buying a risk-free US Treasury, or I can basically, in theory, get an earnings yield of just under 5% from owning equities. Maybe it's attractive enough I want to buy equities. Interestingly, that's the capitalization weighted S&P. If I go to the equal weighted S&P, it's at 17 times, so I can get a 6% yield there. But it's a pretty expensive market. Now, I'll come back to why I think that 4% yield is so important. So the left-hand side, by the way, is all US market indices. The right-hand side is non-US. So pretty much across the board, non-US markets are cheaper than the US. And I think they should be, but in some cases, I think they're too cheap. Because you also need to look at what's the return on capital that companies generate when you invest in them. The US has the highest return on equity of the world. 18.5% from the S&P. The next closest market is the FTSE 100 in the UK at 14.5. If I look at other markets like Japan, 8.5. But when I look at these markets, I personally think emerging markets are very attractive now. Japan's attractive, and the US is attractive. But the key in the US is figuring out where you want to be. And by the way, these charts, compliments of UBS, are very interesting. What they show is the roller coaster we've ridden in the last 25 months. Because as good as the last year was, the year before that was pretty horrible, right? And so what you see, if I go back, this is the S&P 500. But what we've done is we've deconstructed it and said, okay, let's look at the biggest 6 companies in the S&P 500 and what they did. In the red font, they went down 41% from the peak in 2021 to the trough in October of 2022, or sorry, January 23. Then they went up 106%. If you focus on the blue font, in total over the last 25, 26 months, the stocks are up 21%, but their earnings grew 44%. So the price, the earnings you're paying actually went down 5.5 multiples. So in theory, what that means is I'm going to say the spectacular 6 because Tesla flunked out this year. So effectively, the spectacular 6 have gotten cheaper because the earnings have been so good. Now, one takeaway might be for you to say, well, then I should buy more of these. But I just want to remind you in December 2021, sorry, December of 2020, which I think that's misled. Yeah, December of 2021, the US 10-year Treasury yield was at 1.5%. So if you wanted to buy a risk-free Treasury, you had to pay 65 times earnings for it. Paying 35 times earnings for Microsoft and Tesla seemed like a pretty good idea. But if you can buy a US Treasury now with a 4% yield at 25 times, are you really going to pay those kind of multiples again? I don't think so. What did the rest of the market do? The rest of the market has done nothing in the last 26 months. So basically, the S&P 494 flat, Part of the reason they're flat, earnings only grew 3.8%, not 44%. So the market has been pretty smart at saying, you're not growing earnings, why should I pay more? And the PE multiple's down 0.7 multiples. Now my point here, by the way, is I don't think you should be selling all of your Spectacular 6 if you own it. But I do think they've gotten pretty expensive. And if you think about the next 2 years, if you're going to see the Spectacular 6 keep working, the only way that can happen is if the companies buying goods and services from them get a return on investment. So if the rest of the market can't grow earnings by using AI and advancing technology, they're not going to keep buying as much, which means the Spectacular 6 aren't going to get 44% earnings growth again. They're going to have lower earnings growth. So my view here is this is a good time to be peeling, taking a little money off the table, moving it into the rest of the US market that hasn't gone up as much as the Spectacular 6, but also to consider moving it into other markets like emerging markets, like Japanese equities, like infrastructure stocks. When I look at the rest of the world, and the reason I said at the very beginning there were 3 messages. 1, inflation's down a lot, but it's not over. Number 2, the economic outlook is better, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. It might be a little softer than people expect this year. But number 3, there are still opportunities in the market and their risk. And I do think those opportunities include a number of other markets outside the Spectacular 6, and they include certain alternative investments that might protect you against inflation. And maybe I'll stop there because I've run over. The time card stopped showing up, which means I'm done. So I'm happy to take questions for as long as you'd like, but maybe we can pause there. Yes, sir.
Where do you, like, politics aside, how do you see the market reacting to the U.S. election in November, and kind of what, should either party win? What does the market anticipate from a reaction standpoint?
So I think we're about to publish in the next week or two a document on this with our geopolitical advisory team that I've worked on. We've gone through pretty much every substantive policy area to figure out what policies might really change. And I'm going to give you 2 answers here, not to be the 8-handed economist. But the one answer is if you really focus on what moves financial markets, these are things you think about. When you buy stocks, you're buying all the future cash flows of stocks. I have a lot of friends who hated Trump, and they were like, why is the stock market going up? And I said, well, because he cut taxes, which means you get more cash flow, net of tax, and because the market's doing well, because profits are doing well. The market doesn't care about his social policies. When I look at what you would get from Trump this time, I think the biggest difference is trade. Trump has promised a 10% tariff on every import into the United States, regardless of where it comes from. And he's talked about potentially 60% tariffs on products from China. Now, if you think about being in the C-suite of any company, this is not what you want to deal with, right? Because you've got to figure out, if you're importing things from China, can I get it anywhere else? Does my competition buy it from China? So are we all facing this price hike? And then you have to think about, sorry, it's going to get economic, what's the elasticity of demand for the product? Meaning, is it something people absolutely have to have, like diapers, and they'll pay whatever the price is? Or is it a discretionary item where they're like, you know what, the price went up 30%, not buying it? So I think the impact here is an inflation impact, because you raise prices on all these imports, we're paying for it. Domestically, if you look at the tariffs under the first Trump administration, it all went through to the US consumers and companies that bought them. So there's an inflation impact, but there's also a profit margin impact, because some companies, if they sell discretionary items, they're going to have to take part of the hit because they won't be able to sell it anymore. So that's one big one. Tax rates, so I should step back. That happens regardless of control of Congress, because Trump can do almost all of that without Congress being involved. When it comes to tax rates, I am assuming if Trump wins the election, he'll have a Republican Senate. And I assume if Biden wins, he'll also have a Republican Senate. It's very hard for the Democrats to control the Senate after this election. In the House, though, I think if Trump wins, he gets a House that's Republican as well, so he has full control of government. He's talked about cutting corporate taxes again from 21% to 15%. I was a little hesitant to think that can happen, but I think if there's full Republican control, you would get that tax cut. That could add 5% to S&P earnings. The problem is it also adds even more to an already giant deficit, because it's hard to see where you pay for that. Because I believe regardless of who the president is, you're going to have to spend more on the military because the world is getting more dangerous, and you're going to have to spend more on certain other areas. So it's hard to see how you offset that. And then on personal tax, surprisingly, there's not a lot of difference between the two of them. Trump would basically, in case you don't remember, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017, the personal tax cuts expire at the end of 2025. Trump presumably would make those tax cuts permanent, which would add $330 billion a year to the U.S. deficit in that forecast period after 2025. Biden has said he won't raise taxes on anyone who makes under $400,000 a year. In his last two budgets, he raised that to $450,000. So effectively, 99% of people get their tax cuts extended. So you raise the deficit $300 billion instead of $330 billion. So to me, personal tax cut-wise, there's not really a difference, except if you're lucky enough to make over $450,000 a year, then your tax rates might go up, and you might fund the part of that $30 billion. If I look beyond those areas, sorry, this is an eternal answer. If I look beyond those areas, the other sectors I think would react would be financials, because there are certain regulatory moves Biden has been supporting that would make the big banks hold more capital. That would be gone under Trump, so you would probably see the big banks go up. Fossil fuels would probably rally initially under Trump because of less environmental regulation. Key thing to keep in mind there is I say initially because Trump would also open more federal land to drilling, which would mean more supply coming on the market, which might lower the commodity price itself and make those companies less profitable, so that might neutralize. And then the other area is healthcare, where biopharma would be happy with a Trump election. Hospitals and healthcare services would rather have Biden. Biopharma doesn't like Biden because they put price caps on insulin and would probably do that to more drugs if they could. Healthcare services and hospitals like Biden because more people covered under the Affordable Care Act means more people using your service means you make more money. So I think those are the big picture issues there. Then the second part of the answer, and I'll keep this short, is predictability. I mean, I do think investors should be really careful in how you evaluate a Trump 2 versus a Trump 1. Trump 1 was thinking about re-election, and he had a lot of kind of traditional institutional Republicans. Remember, Rex Tillerson was there. There were other people who were from corporate America. I think in a Trump 2, it would be a very different cabinet. And I think the restraints would probably be gone, which means there could be more unpredictable things that happen. And markets don't like unpredictability. And probably the most important thing that would not affect markets is on the geopolitical front is I do think, Trump has been promising to cut off aid to Ukraine. Apparently that's what he said to Viktor Orban this week, and saying he would end the war in Ukraine in a day. Again, I grew up as a Republican. When I was 14, I spoke at the Republican convention in Texas after Bob Dole. This is unrecognizable to me. I grew up as a Cold War hawk. And it's, to me, the idea that we would shut off funding to Ukraine basically means Putin can roll through Ukraine, because there's no way they, even if Europe gives them money, Europe can't produce military equipment, which is a real problem that Trump is right about. But I worry that the signal it sends to Putin, if he wants to go into another country, is pretty horrible. And the signal it sends to NATO and other allies in Asia is the U.S. is not dependable. And the worst one is the signal it sends to Xi Jinping is, if you don't have Ukraine's back, you're not going to have Taiwan's back. And I think this just introduces more unpredictability. And so, sorry if this sounds like a biased answer. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure this out. And I just worry that, we tend to get focused on domestic culture wars and things like that. I worry that we've had 75 years of kind of global stability, and we could really be raising questions about that. And the hard part is there are big issues Biden hasn't dealt with, but it's hard to gauge all of this. And so sorry if I made half the room angry. Yes, sir.
Real estate going. Look, we're king of forecast there just now. Doesn't look like it's hitting.
Thank you. I'm glad. So the question was, where do I see commercial real estate going? And I think it's funny. I left it off on the income-producing real assets. I'm dying to put commercial real estate there. And by the way, it's interesting. On Bloomberg this morning, there's a headline from Jonathan Gray at Blackstone saying, now's the time you need to be buying commercial real estate. Now, I think they have a few funds they're raising, so timing is important. But I do think over the next 2-3 years, you probably want to be looking at putting money to work in opportunistic real estate. And what I mean by that is you've got amazing properties that are going to clear the market at 30 cents on the dollar. And again, I say amazing properties meaning location and what you could do with the property, but you need incredibly low prices to make it work because, I'll give you an example. We work in 30 Rockefeller in New York, so 30 Rock, where the ice skating rink is. They recently announced they're leasing 10 stories of 30 Rock to the Little Nell Hotel from Aspen. So they only have one hotel in Aspen. The rates start at $1,300 a night. They're going to do 10 floors at 30 Rock. Now, 30 Rock is full of asbestos. So changing the floor plan to be hotel rooms. And again, if you've seen 30 Rock, it's huge. You're not going to pay $2,000 a night to have a view of the elevator shaft. So you're going to have rooms that all have a view. And by the way, there are 4 toilets on the entire 58th floor of the building. I mean, like, you gotta have a toilet in every room. So you're gonna be doing, but to me, I'm thinking Tishman Speyer must have given them an incredible deal. And just one other anecdote, there's a building at Canary Wharf in London that's on the market right now at 70% below what they asked for at 6 years ago. Now, I mean, you've got buildings in places that used to be really prime that are going well, and I think you're going to get more of that in even New York City and even San Francisco, as regulatorily overly burdened as they are working with developers because they realize the cities are dead if they don't get that tax revenue. So I think this could be a really interesting space. My question is it too early? I talked to a friend who used to run all of commercial mortgage-backed securitization for Credit Suisse for years. He's in this space, and he's like, it's too early to buy and it's too late to sell. I think that's where you are, but I also think when the Fed starts cutting rates, the bids are going to go up because people are going to say, okay, I can't earn as much on risk-free, I need to do something with the money. And I think the people who own the properties are going to say, okay, maybe I can afford to take the hit now, and you're going to start to see more trades clear. And sorry, one last part, $929 billion of commercial real estate debt is maturing this year, which is a lot of debt, and 20% of that's office debt, so you're going to have some forced sales. So you're going to start to see trades print at really low prices. And maybe that's when you want to start thinking about putting money to work there. Sorry, I'll try to keep the answer shorter next time. Yes, sir, back.
Ron, great job today. Thank you for being here. You mentioned a favorable investment case for emerging markets.
Yeah.
So if you could elaborate a little bit on that. And then also, I'm not sure I understood whether China should be included in that or not. So maybe clarify that for us as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the reason I like EM is, and by the way, I've been at Lazard 23 years. We've always had a big EM business. So in theory, I always had a reason to be conflicted, okay? I've never recommended EM until the last year. And my colleagues who are in the EM business have always said EM is cheap. They would always say it's 30% cheaper in the US. And I'm like, okay, fine. To me, an investment thesis has to include valuation, but valuation is not a thesis. So it's necessary but insufficient. When I look at EM today, I see higher macroeconomic growth rates than developed markets. I mean, go back to that very first slide, 0.5% in Europe, 70 basis points Japan, 1.5 maybe in the US, even though consensus is 2. In EM, you're going to get potentially 4% real growth. But importantly, I think when the Fed and the ECB start cutting rates, you're going to get bigger rate cuts in emerging markets. The emerging market central banks raised rates faster than developed market central banks, and they raised them more because they knew that they couldn't afford to lose the confidence of global investors because they need foreign capital. So they were more aggressive. They have more room to cut. The reason they haven't been cutting so far is they couldn't cut because US rates were so high. If you cut your rates, then currencies would go down because people would move their money back to a safer country. Bottom line is the bigger rate cuts, I think, will accelerate growth in EM more than it's going to accelerate growth in developed markets. So that growth gap's going to widen out. But number two is what we found is when we analyzed all of the countries in EM over the last 5-10 years, returns on capital in most of the countries have been going up for the last 5 years. What that means is basically companies are doing a better job managing their capital. And in our analysis, historically, when returns on capital go up, stocks outperform. And so that's important. The number three, I showed you that foreign direct investment slide about China. The money hasn't started showing up in these other countries yet, but we're starting to see evidence of money going into Mexico in the auto sector, money going into India in the service sector. As companies start pulling money or reallocating their next investment to other EMs, that's going to add even more growth. And the last but not least, it's really cheap. The S&P's at 21 times earnings, EM's at 12.5. And so one last thing is a lot of clients I've met with, and I've traveled a lot globally this year. I was telling Michael, Taylor Swift has been stalking me. Is I was in Melbourne, she showed up in Melbourne. I was in Sydney, she showed up in Sydney. I was in Singapore, she showed up anyway. But we'll tell more stories about that later. She didn't find me though. I guess when I look around the world, the people I've been meeting with, a lot of them you can tell wish they had more money in equities. They've got a lot of money in cash. In Australia, people have a lot of money in what they call term deposits. In the US, people have a lot of $6 trillion in money market funds, up from $4.5 trillion 2 years ago. There's a lot of money sitting in cash where it's been great to be in cash because you're getting paid. But people know those rates are going to go down. But they're terrified of putting more money into equities because you're at all-time highs, and who wants to be the idiot who bought at the all-time high? So what I'm encouraging people to do is add risk in equities, but do it in a less risky way through something that's a lot cheaper, like emerging market equities. And again, you shouldn't go from 50% US to 40, but maybe you go from 50 to 48%. And maybe you put a percent in Japan, and you put a percent in EM, and you move some money around. I think you could get some good returns there. Or if you want to put money off the sidelines into equities, maybe you diversify your risk a little bit and get a lower valuation. Yes, sir.
To build on the commercial loan market that the gentleman there brought the question, but do you see any more regional bank failures, considering that they own a lot of this, a lot on the balance sheet, it's commercial loan, but do you think there could be more failures this year?
Yeah, so, the quick question was, do you see more regional bank failures on commercial real estate? The easy answer is yes. But I don't think you'll see anything as market shaking as, say, First Republic or Silicon Valley, and we could dig into details after why each of those failed. They were very unique. Those were all interest rate risk management, not asset quality. Interestingly, the recent issues in New York Community Bank have been all about the fact that they had what they thought was a bulletproof asset class of lending to multifamily rent-controlled apartments in New York. Problem with rent control is when mortgage rates go up 500 basis points, you can't raise the rent. And so they finally had to provision against losses on a property that no one thought they had to worry about. But bottom line, when I look over the next 5 years, I think you're going to see, I don't know, you could easily see 100 banks go under, 200. There are 4,000 banks in the U.S. We don't need 4,000 banks. Canada has like 5. So there are a lot of, to me, the key thing is going to be the banks that are going to go under are sadly probably going to be the community banks, the local banks that no one's going to read about in the Wall Street Journal. The Fed's going to basically, the FDIC will get involved and sell the assets, and they'll operate the next week as a different bank. And so I think you're going to see that, which will probably squeeze funding in some local markets, but I don't think it really moves the big macro picture materially. And one, I could drown you in details, but there are $4.8 trillion of commercial real estate in the U.S. in debt. 2.9 trillion of that's in the banks. 2 trillion of that is the banks under the top 25. And so, the top banks like JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, B of A, Wells has a lot of commercial real estate, but relative to assets, it's a fraction of what the small banks. The small banks typically can't compete in credit cards. They can't compete in auto. They do the strip shopping center in the suburbs. And so, part of it, then you also have to dig another layer and say, okay, well, $2 trillion commercial real estate, if it's an apartment building, you're fine. But if it's an office, you might not be fine. And if it's a retail strip mall, you might not be fine. So you kind of have to be careful about which ones you don't want to own. But yes, you're going to get more bankruptcies. Yes, sir.
You mentioned Japan and Japanese equity several times. Why is it that you feel those are attractive enough? If you were to jump in right now, too late for this book?
So on Japan, by the way, Japan has rallied a lot in the last year. And this is one where when I talk to clients globally again, they say, okay, everyone told me about Japan for the last year, but what's interesting is people still don't own it. It's under-owned by international investors because a lot of investors in the US might have a portfolio where you have a manager who does your US equities, you might have a manager who does non-US developed markets and maybe an emerging market manager. The assumption has always been that non-US developed, they'll own my Japan for me, but most of them learned in the last 20 years, you just don't waste your time on Japan. Now, what's exciting to me about Japan is you've had a lot of governance reforms in the last decade. Things move really slowly in Japan, but in the last year and a half, the Tokyo Stock Exchange came out with a new rule that said if your stock trades below book value for an extended period of time, you have to announce a capital plan to fix that. So they basically said they'll delist you if you don't make your share price improve. And what you've gotten is record levels of buybacks and dividends from Japanese companies trying to better manage their capital. Now that's good. Half the companies that were required to do it have done it so far. The rest are working on it. But then the Tokyo Stock Exchange announced 6 weeks ago that in March of 2025, all prime listed companies in Japan have to announce their financials in English and Japanese simultaneously. Historically, only 40% of companies did that. So if you're the American investor who doesn't speak Japanese, you're always the last one to figure out you should be selling. So they're going to basically try to do that to get global investors into Japan. What matters there, as I showed that chart before, Japanese returns on equity are the lowest of any major market at 8.7%. Well, investors in the US and Europe aren't going to tolerate 8.7. They're going to demand better operations. And I think this is also going to open the door in Japan for private equity. So the government is actually more open, and you've seen a lot of the big PE firms investing and opening offices and expanding them in Japan. This is what private equity is all about. Buying companies with bad balance sheets or too much capital, better yet, not bad balance sheets, but too much capital, fixing their balance sheet, fixing their operations, raising returns, and then selling it off into the market. I think it could be a watershed on that front. But there's one other piece. In Japan, 56% of household financial assets are in bank deposit accounts and currency, earning zero. Now, inflation's been 3% a year for the last 3 years. So, proverbial Mrs. Watanabe is losing money every day. If inflation's going to be 1.5%, 2% for the next few years, they're going to have to start moving that money out of cash. Only 10% of their financial assets are in equities. In the US, I think it's 40%. So we have an equity culture. Japan has not had one. I don't think that 10% is going to double, but even if it goes from 10 to 12 or 13, that's an enormous amount of cash that's going to move into the market. It's an uncorrelated market. As I said, it's the only central bank that hasn't raised rates yet. The economy is growing above its potential. I think there's some opportunity there. Could be really interesting for, a small kind of allocation of capital. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what's keeping your geopolitical team awake at night?
The biggest long-term issue is just U.S.-China, and we can dig into that at length. But the near-term issue, and maybe this is subsiding, is the Middle East. I mean, we've talked about this. I mean, the U.S. does not want escalation and expansion. Iran theoretically does not want escalation and expansion. The last thing Iran wants is a war with the U.S. and Israel, right? Because they will lose. But they could do a lot of damage to Israel. And by the way, I should note, the International Atomic Energy Agency in December published a report saying after October 7th, Iran threw all the shackles off the nuclear program. And they basically said, we're going to ramp this as fast as we can, and we're going to enrich uranium as fast as we can. And one of our senior advisors in the team was Deputy Director of Intelligence at the CIA. She was CEO of Kissinger Associates for 10 years. Her comment to me was, if you figure out how to get from 20% enrichment of uranium to 60%, it's not very hard to get the rest of the way. And they've gotten there some time ago. And so presumably Iran has nuclear weapons now, or the capability of at least having them. So we all say we don't want escalation and expansion. But let's be honest, since October 7th, what's happened? It's escalated and expanded, right? You've got the Houthis attacking ships. You've got Hezbollah shooting across the northern border of Lebanon. I still worry that the markets aren't pricing that. And all it takes is the Strait of Hormuz is 36 miles wide. 20% of the world's oil goes through there every day. If you get any kind of skirmish there, it blows up my inflation story on the U.S. It could basically cause upheaval. I don't think it's going to happen. The reason I say it's subsiding in recent days, there's an article in the FT yesterday. Apparently, the U.S. had secret talks indirectly with Iran, where we went to Oman and we basically talked to the Omanis, and then the Omanis went to another building and talked to the Iranians, so no one could say we talked, which is how we typically negotiate with Iran. But I worry about that one in the near term. But China long term is my biggest concern. The Chinese military, the investments they're making are tremendous. What makes me more confident that we won't have a conflict with China in the next 3-4 years is they've never fought a war. So if you're Xi Jinping and you've got a one-child policy that you scrapped, but no one's had any more kids after the one-child, in fact, birth rates went down when they got rid of it, are you really going to send people's only child into a war when you don't know if you can win? Number two, Xi Jinping's biggest takeaway from Ukraine, other than the West isn't dependable, has to be those Russian generals told Putin they would win in weeks. If my generals say they're going to win, are they really going to win? And then number three, what I've learned from one of our other senior advisors is General John Abizaid, who was the U.S. ambassador to the Secretary of Defense in Ukraine. He was our ambassador to Saudi Arabia. He ran all of CENTCOM in the Army. He basically explained to me the Chinese don't have interoperability. So kind of using Michael's explanation earlier, it's like the Army and the Navy. The Chinese Army and Navy don't coordinate. And what's been interesting is the Chinese apparently spend more time on propaganda and political education than they do on coordinating operations, which is great news for us. But the key to us being able to defeat China if there were a conflict over Taiwan is you have to have all of your allies in the region help. Because, I mean, they're, a short distance away from Taiwan with a bigger Navy every day. What the U.S. has been doing is we've convinced Japan to double their defense budget. Japan is now the biggest importer of military equipment in the world. They topped Saudi Arabia, which had been number one for 20 years. Number two is in the Philippines, Duterte's gone, Marcos is the president. We're probably going to reopen Subic Air Force Base, which is the biggest military base outside the U.S. in the world. And the whole idea there is you need Japan, you need South Korea, you need the Philippines, you need all these people around convincingly saying they will work with us if there's an attack. And that's how you get China to never think about attacking, which is why I made the comments about geopolitics earlier. To me, the whole thing we should all want is deterrence, because deterrence is how you never have the war. But to not have the war, you have to convince the other side that you're willing to have the war. And so that's my biggest concern on the next 10 years. And I do think what we're doing right now, including things like TikTok, by the way, is very smart. Again, I find it shocking that politics are getting to something about TikTok. P.S. There's an article this morning that Steve Mnuchin is looking at forming a group to buy TikTok with U.S. money out of ByteDance. I mean, young people are all up in arms because they can't waste their lives on TikTok. And people literally, I read an article where people were saying, that's where I got my news, and I'm like, that's what's wrong with this world. But we need to basically, if you think about it, the next round of restrictions the U.S. is going to put on China is in biotechnology. Because our biggest fear is if China's got all this machine learning and big data, and then they get into biotech, and then they have your personal information, they can custom design viruses that take out a certain part of the population. And by the way, years ago, this didn't, it's probably not something you talk about at the Catholic Foundation a lot, but there was a gay dating app called Grindr. The Chinese owned it. The US government made them sell it because they didn't want them to know who had HIV, because part of your profile in that app was saying HIV status. But these are things I don't wake up every day thinking about usually, but we have to. One last thing to leave you awake at night. Sorry, you asked the question. 90% of the ingredients in generic antibiotics come from China. So we always talk about China's going to shut off rare earths and we can't create more Teslas. Who cares? If we have a conflict and they shut off the raw ingredients that then go to India that get processed and that we then buy at a good pharmacy, I just think there's so many vulnerabilities, and we need a really systematic approach to de-risk, as they talk about in DC, and this is bipartisan, and hopefully we're making the right progress. But I can leave you sleepless nights now. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I got stuck.
Well, we'll forget about that. Anyways. So in closing, the staff at the Catholic Foundation, we thank you all so much for sharing your valuable time with us this morning at the 4th Annual Catholic Foundation Investment Forum. We hope you found the information beneficial. We'd like to thank the Board of Directors, the committee members, volunteers, and Truce May with Chris Floral Design for the beautiful flowers. The proceeds from the flowers go to the Christopher Wynn Fund, which benefits the charity Chris 180. So please designate someone at your table to please take the centerpieces to enjoy. We're also very grateful to our sponsors that helped make this event possible. Georgia United Credit Union, the friendly and affordable alternative to big banking rooted in serving its members and local communities. Smith Howard, tax and accounting advisory firm with a reputation for doing more than expected. The St. Thomas More Society, incorporated by a group of Catholic lawyers in Atlanta, whose objective is providing a means of fostering the spiritual, intellectual, and professional growth of its members while providing service to the Roman Catholic Church of Georgia. And our media sponsor, the Quest Atlanta Catholic Radio, where lives have changed by listening to the broadcasting. Please visit the sponsorship table outside the room on your way out to learn more. Later today, you'll receive a survey via email. Your feedback is really important to us. The Catholic Foundation Professional Advisors Network brings together attorneys, accountants, financial planners, and wealth managers and insurance providers to promote, collaborate, education, and leadership in current and legacy giving among their Catholic clients. We invite you to partner with us. If you're interested in individual or family philanthropy, please reach out to me or to Nancy or to one of our team members, and we can help you to grow or establish an institutional relationship with the Catholic Foundation. We look forward to having these conversations with you. A very special thank you to our presenters, to Father Michael Silloway, to Lisa Churchfield, to Jaime Lanier, and a tremendous gratitude goes to our friend at Atlanta Consulting Group, Michael Butkus, and our keynote speaker, Ron Temple with Lazard. Whether you're a professional advisor or an individual at parish, a school, or nonprofit organization who wishes to make a lasting impact in our community, we're here to serve each and every one of you. Everything we do is aligned with our Catholic faith. We're so fortunate to do this important ministry in our archdiocese. Thank you again. God bless, and have a wonderful day.